It was April 19th of 2020, and it was the middle of the night, and my partner actually nudged me awake and said, "Hey, does your newsroom know what's going on in Portapique?" And he handed me his phone, and I started looking through the photos on social media, and I saw that there were several homes on fire. And then I checked out Twitter, and I saw that RCMP had tweeted about a firearms incident in the area. And I can't really describe it, but I knew that it was something big. And so at 3 a.m., I called RCMP, and I woke up the communications officer. Turns out those fires marked the beginning of a mass shooting. A lone gunman masquerading as a police officer killed 22 people, including a pregnant woman. This year, there was a public inquiry, and I covered that inquiry. Here are some of the biggest things we learned. A word of warning before we get into things. We're going to share moments from the rampage, including audio that might be hard to hear. The inquiry shed light on the minute-by-minute accounts from the night of April 18th in Portapique.
Children?
Yeah, they got 4 kids there that parents were killed there, and so they want to have them checked out.
So 4 kids to be assessed.
From those children to the 2 people wandering the dark woods nearby, hiding, people experienced real horrors that night as the gunman moved from home to home. We also heard from 3 police officers who sped to the scene and showed up to the sounds of gunfire, explosions, and burning homes. Portapique residents told 911 dispatchers they knew who the shooter was and that he was driving a car that looked like a police cruiser. RCMP assumed it was a decommissioned car. These testimonies were the first time in 2 years the public heard what police faced that night. Frontline officers even said they wanted these details out there because of the perception that they didn't do enough. That night was filled with confusion, chaos, and communication breakdowns. One officer described the chain of command as too many cooks in the kitchen, and it was unclear who was in charge.
Hey, it's Jen Clark from RCMP Dispatch. Just to let you guys know, we're now getting reports that there's possibly multiple victims, fatalities. But to keep staging at this point, and what is your staging point?
The 3 Mounties who got there first were the only ones on the scene for about 90 minutes. They were on foot because they didn't want a police vehicle to become a billboard for the gunman. They worried for hours he might still be in the area and ambushed them. The same officers told the inquiry they lacked the training for the kind of situation they were in, tracking down an active shooter in the woods in the dark.
At 10-4, we saw somebody with a flashlight that went dark. We have no idea where he went. We're going to go back to the red house. We're going to set up there to make sure those children are safe.
There were other officers there, but they were staged much farther back on the main road. The arriving officers resorted to using Google Maps on their personal phones to find their way around. Meanwhile, at the command center, officers in charge couldn't get their mapping software to work, so they ended up mounting paper maps on the wall instead. All of these things created slowdowns, especially when it came to putting up the roadblocks. These were blind spots. The RCMP thought they secured the scene in Portapique, but the gunman had escaped by around 10:45 p.m. But by sunrise on the 19th, 13 people were dead. Homes in Portapique had burned to the ground. The RCMP had tweeted only once by 11:30 p.m. that they were responding to a firearms complaint. It took hours before the RCMP realized the gunman was driving a replica cruiser, despite numerous reports from people in Portapique. It took even longer to notify the public.
The car we're looking for is a fully marked PC, 28 Bravo 11 ID on it.
Yeah, he just passed you going Mastown. I think you get a reflective vest on, guys. Driving slow, smiled as you went by, white Caucasian male.
Police finally realized the gunman was in a replica cruiser around 7 a.m. 2 hours later, a member of the RCMP's communication team, Jennifer Clark, says she was asked to draft a tweet. Top of mind was how to differentiate the shooter's vehicle from actual cruisers and verify details. She used this photo of the replica, added graphics, then passed a tweet draft up the chain of command to be approved. She described pacing the floor as she waited. The tweet went out at 10:17 a.m. That was the first time the public was notified the gunman was driving what looked like a police cruiser. This process took 3 hours, 3 critical hours slowed essentially by red tape. In that time, 6 more people died in different locations.
Has there been discussion about a media release in regard to that vehicle, just for the public to be on the lookout for that and to also be aware that we don't know if he's got uniform or access to anything else, but just to keep an eye out for that car?
That's the voice of Constable Heidi Stevenson. She'd been in her vehicle, listening to radio chatter about the replica. Stevenson died that day, but it wasn't until the inquiry we found out she had suggested over the police radio to tell people about the cruiser. Moments before she encountered the gunman, he had just shot and injured Constable Chad Morrison. He turned south on this highway as Stevenson was driving the on-ramp. The gunman rammed his vehicle into hers. Stevenson grabbed her pistol and fired 14 times. He shot back. She managed a shot to the gunman's head before she was killed. Where Stevenson's bullets hit, the fact that her radio was activated during the shootout, these were all key details revealed at the inquiry. These details also later helped tactical officers identify the gunman at a gas station in a completely different vehicle. Alert Ready is the national emergency alert system that pushes messages to radios, televisions, and LTE-connected cell phones. It was not used as the rampage unfolded. The inquiry learned that while Nova Scotia's Emergency Management Office was ready to send an alert, the RCMP weren't prepared to use it until 11:21 a.m. on April 19th, just 5 minutes before the gunman was killed. Multiple officers and civilians told the inquiry they didn't know the Alert Ready system was even an option, but municipal police forces in Nova Scotia testified they knew it was available precisely for this kind of situation. The fact that RCMP did not send out an emergency alert became the focus and frustration of many of the victims' families. They feel that had an emergency alert gone out, lives would have been saved. In July of 2021, well before the inquiry began, the Nova Scotia government adjusted the rules around Alert Ready to give RCMP direct access. The inquiry eventually shifted its focus from police operations to the gunman and his relationship with Lisa Banfield. They were together for 19 years. Banfield said the abuse she suffered began in the early 2000s. She described several incidents of physical assaults, verbal abuse, and escape attempts. Witnesses told the inquiry the gunman was an abuser, that he used coercive control over Banfield and other women he exploited and abused outside that relationship, including clients of his denture clinic. Banfield was the focus of much blame in the months after the shooting, but that blame stemmed from unanswered questions. How could someone not speak out against someone who was so abusive to her? The inquiry allowed time for the public to understand what it's like to be controlled, as Banfield was, to feel there's no way out. Still, it's important to note some people don't believe Banfield, in part because she was charged with supplying ammunition used in the mass shooting. Those charges were later resolved, but it did not absolve her in the eyes of some. Before April of 2020, authorities had previously raised red flags about the gunman's activities. Search warrant documents show the Canada Border Services Agency determined the gunman crossed the border at Woodstock, New Brunswick, a short drive from Houlton, Maine, 15 times in the 2 years before the shootings. The CBSA had flagged the gunman's travel in and out of the U.S. And while he was a successful denturist, the inquiry heard he wasn't well liked. In 2005, the Denturist Licensing Board of Nova Scotia launched an investigation into him for improper billing and to follow up on allegations he was aggressive with patients. A settlement agreement was signed in 2007. And arguably the most important of all, he was known to police. An RCMP officer from Bible Hill met with the gunman about 16 times for a number of reasons, including tips on local crime. Constable Greg Wiley was never asked to officially investigate the gunman before April 18th of 2020, even after reports of illegal firearms. In the wake of the shooting, rumors have been swirling that the gunman was a police informant. Because of this persistent rumor, the Commission did its own investigation. After it was complete, the inquiry took the extraordinary steps to confirm in writing that the perpetrator was not an RCMP informant. The inquiry revealed details of the relationship between the grieving families and Constable Wayne Bent, the RCMP family liaison. In some cases, relatives waited hours, even days, for information about their loved ones. Some even resorted to tracking down officers at the scene. The inquiry even heard how RCMP officers pointed guns at the families of Heather O'Brien and Alana Jenkins as they were turned away from crime scenes. With the sole exception of Constable Heidi Stevenson's family, because of a separate internal protocol, families of the 21 other victims said they had to plead with police for information. A summary issued by the Commission said it became apparent that the RCMP did not have any idea how to handle the situation or how to talk to victims. Chief Superintendent Darren Campbell, who was a support services officer at the time of the shootings, said none of this should have happened.
I want to express my sincere condolences and I apologize for failing.
Public hearings came to an end in September after releasing interviews from 230 people, about 8,000 documents, and 7 months of testimony. We did get the answers to some of the questions we've been asking since that night, but for some, the answers didn't necessarily help. The final statements at the inquiry included concerns from families of the victims, and for some, their grievances with the RCMP are as pointed as ever. Others were vocal in their criticism of the inquiry itself, whether enough was done or if it was done correctly. The real test will come with the final report in March.
There's hope. That's all we've had is hope. I mean, we fought hard to get it. We voiced our concerns along the way. That's all we got left now is hope.